As we move on, I should note that I am aware of the fact that for some, my Shoah Foundation test of my faith would be thought to be inadequate. The counter-argument would go something like this. God was under no obligation to answer the prayers of people suffering through a genocide because they hadn't approached him through Jesus Christ. To this, I have two responses. The first is a reiteration of a point I made in part 1 of this story. It might, although I believe it would fail, be a sufficient rebuttal if the rate of answered prayer was demonstrably higher for Christians. But as I said earlier, in my experience, God seemingly always answered through so-called providence. This is to say, he was utterly inactive, and the word providence was, ironically, a provisionary euphemism for this inactivity. The second response I have is a challenge to the stupidity of this notion of a heavenly bureaucracy. One where because a small child born into a family because of God's providence, which had not raised them Christian, would be left to watch both parents being sent to a gas chamber, despite their pleading to God because they hadn't offered up prayers with the proper nomenclature. If this is the way the system is set up, that is, God being unwilling to act because his proper name hadn't been called out amidst significant suffering, I could no longer admire such a being. I understand that this is an emotional response to suffering, but this is why I allowed myself to view so many videos on the Holocaust. I recognize that however plentiful the content I encountered detailing human suffering was, it would yet be only a mere atom in the huge aggregate of distress and sorrow. Yet this cross-section of human calamity would have the effect of overwhelming my syllogistic objections. The propositional abstraction of the problem of evil was a very different thing than full immersion into stories of human suffering. While I was prepared to deal with the former, and my study of logic and theology had thereby insulated me, when I decided to look, without the veil of syllogistic abstraction, into the historical record of human suffering, the same veil's not a sufficient barrier to the stench. All of this has been noted, but if we swap out the variables particular to the Holocaust and instead look at the Congolese genocide, or that of Rwanda, which occurred in areas inhabited by quite a lot of Christians, we find the same kind of divine unresponsiveness. I felt I needed to prepare myself and see if I could go on living without a God to appeal to in the face of such evil. I found that having a God peg with which I could use to fasten the tent of my epistemology into an axiomatic ground offered zero consolation in the face of real suffering. Back to the story. So, now that I had settled on the idea that this Christian God stuff is false, now what? Would I search for a new religion to replace it, or would I just settle into my newfound atheism? I think the work that it took to undo the Christian brainwashing was so exhausting that I couldn't see myself trying to find something to replace it. In fact, any system of belief that offered slim evidence but made huge promises got a raised eyebrow. This pretty much excluded all religions. I was now thoroughly uninterested in investigating other religious claims. After investing my life, up to this point, in Christian concerns and dogma, what did I now have to show for it? There was no discernible equity in religion. The religion marketplace is so vast that the paradox of choice is multiplied and exponentially increased. The paradox of choice is the phenomenon documented in a 2004 book written by Barry Schwartz, bearing the same title. In this book, Schwartz shows that an overabundance of choices makes it paradoxically harder to choose. If this is true, as I believe it is, then religion is the ultimate example of this. LiveScience.com, an aggregator of scientific data across multiple disciplines, reports that there are 45,000 Christian denominations. This is just within Christianity. Wikipedia cites a journal called History in Africa, Volume 32, claiming that there are, quote, an estimated 10,000 distinct religions worldwide, unquote. There is not enough time in one's life to take all of these religious claims seriously. The exhaustion of disproving Christianity had emptied my tank along with my curiosity regarding religion. I began to find the entire framing of the conversation surrounding a God to often be full of presumptions. Why are we discussing a God as opposed to the possibility of gods? The conversation is very often inherently anthropomorphic, but why is this necessary? Humans seem too narcissistic to even entertain a question of this magnitude without working some iteration of ourselves into the discussion. When you think of it, why is so much premium placed on the importance of human life? Imagine thinking that because a roach or a rat was born, it now possesses a life which will reverberate into the future indefinitely. Even after the rat is dead, its so-called soul would live on in perpetuity because of the accident of their birth. Very few Christians would entertain this notion because the lives of other creatures are considered to end on the planet when they die. The ability to imagine oblivion for every other creature isn't too difficult for most Christians. So why is a human application of this unfathomable? I thought that if the rate of answered prayer was any indication of anything, it certainly implied that if there were a god or gods, they were running the business of life quite remotely. They seem just fine with allowing what will happen to do just that with no interference. If these deities were this indifferent to my existence, I should return the favor and get on with life. My life would be no worse for it, and perhaps this would give me more time to focus on doing what I could to solve problems myself. I began to find the entire Jesus take the wheel approach to life to be absolutely repugnant. Abdicating agency and responsibility in life is for infants and toddlers. As a man, I would now do what I could, and the rest would be out of my control. I also now realized I had no time to waste. Whatever I was to make of my life, I had to actively involve myself in. I would get on with the business of reading books, but I could save a lot of time spent reading theology. My Sundays, in theory, were an extra day for productivity. I would not have to spend time memorizing verses of the Bible and chapters. I could now just truly relax when I wasn't working. I wouldn't be going to midweek small groups, commuting to them, and spending time huddled around discussing Bible stories before commuting home. Come to think of it, I hadn't even begun to consider the benefits of leaving the faith until I had left. I was mostly preoccupied with being afraid to consider a life of so-called nihilism, like a child learning to swim, dipping their foot in the pool. I don't think that relief from the burden of Christianity is an intrinsically bad motive to leave the faith. But for me, it wasn't in view until I had escaped. Escaped is an apt way to summarize the experience. I now didn't have to force myself to associate with people who repelled me. I didn't have to do the mental work of trying to envision a kingdom of God, which I shared with white American racists. That last idea was something I found to be problematic while I was in the faith. I remember being in my Presbyterian church and hearing my pastor quote a Confederate general, stopping to note his piety and dependence on God's sovereignty during a sermon. I remember thinking this was an odd thing, but not knowing what to do with it. I remember hearing John Piper lionizing Jonathan Edwards in a lecture he gave on his life, stopping toward the end to briefly mention him being a slaver. There is also the Afrikaner Calvinism that undergirded the thinking of many racists in South Africa. I could continue to list the racists that I felt compelled to develop an apologetic for, people who previously shared my faith, which now, in a flash, I was freed from. I was free to simply acknowledge them to be enemies and look for real-world solutions to their bigotry. I even naively believed that if I could just confront my previous Christian friends with the science and textual problems I had discovered, they too might wake up. All I can say is that everywhere I looked, I only saw staunch resistance to the conversation. One even stupidly cited the wisdom of God in ordaining circumcision for human health, failing to see that the good Lord could have just created humans without a safety seal, which needed to be broken. Another interrupted me while talking once to say, "Why don't you just go around committing murder then?" A question which was so evidently idiotic that I think I called it just that. The experiences I was having speaking to the few Christians that would entertain a conversation only helped to solidify my position. There was indeed very little critical thought going on within Christianity, and I could now see it quite clearly. Albert from Ichabod continued to listen to me obsessing over our former faith until one day he said, "You've got to let it go, man." He was right. What good was there in leaving the faith only to spend countless hours discussing it after you'd left? Keep in mind, these conversations were going on for the better part of 10 years. At one point, a Christian I had formerly known of apostatized, and we connected briefly. I soon found he'd trailed off into African spirituality. I could find no fellowship there, because I truly believed that was yet another form of the same credulity I was once plagued with. There was another guy who left, but he seemed to, understandably, just be trying to put that era of his life behind himself. Then I heard about Brady from Icopod. We were cordial years ago, but we hadn't spent much time together. From the first conversation I had with him, I knew he was a kindred spirit. I must have spoken for at least 2 hours during our first conversation. It was such a relief to find someone who understood the problem and was still interested in discussing the ideas. This was catharsis. I was not aware that I needed to talk to someone about these things for my mental health, but here I was, very much gaining the benefit of fellowship post-deconversion. I will bookmark the story here and pick it up in the next, and hopefully final, installment of My Faith Was in Shambles, the story of my deconversion. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Thanks again for listening.